auzim noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. до окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Моя родная, никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Широка моя родная, поколение, поколение, я другой, какой стране не знаю, я какой, да вижу человек. Я другой, какой стране не знаю, я какой, да вижу человек. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Моя родная, чертям спасибо за честь. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, встать в ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И надо ты рабочий, кто не жди, что нам поможет другой. Себе мы свободу добудем твою своей рабочей рукой. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, встать в ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Rein dich ein in der Arbeiter-Einheitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Pod słońcem rasti jasla ma dzieci, rasti i cvietaj zemljo radnih ljudi i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napučini i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita.
Утренний стяг в жизни важен,
первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 28th of September, 2025, and here we are with the latest live stream where we're going to be answering your questions tonight, and also talking a little bit about why reformism is always treacherous, considering that the belief in reformism persists amongst so many who describe themselves as revolutionaries. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that tonight. But before we get started, be sure, if you haven't done already, to like and share the stream, and also subscribe to the various different platforms. So that's YouTube, Kick, Rumble, Twitch, and of course X. And I see most of you are actually watching on X tonight. So good to have you all with us. If Musk discovers us and blows up the channel or something, So let's just get underway with initial comments. The reason why I wanted to talk about reformism is because I've been looking over quite recently, today and yesterday, in fact, the documents from the Sino-Soviet split, and this is of course always interesting to look over the nature of those, the debate between the two most significant parties in the world communist movement at the time, and just how much the Chinese side of it was proved correct in those early critiques. So I'm going to be doing something on that, but in the near future, in fact, probably Wednesday of this week, a video on the first part of a series on the Sino-Soviet split. But what I was reminded as I was reading the CPC's critique of the Italian Communist Party, led by that treacherous old rat Palmiro Togliatti, of the devastating and terrible influence that reformism has actually had. And now I will get into the definition of reformism, because it's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but it needs to be properly understood. And reformism it refers specifically to the idea that you can essentially, via the methods of bourgeois democracy, win control over a bourgeois parliament and use that to enact a series of, or begin a reform process or a series of reforms that can ultimately lead to the slow transformation of a capitalist state into, the lower stages of socialism. And this is a point of view that, in terms of Marxism, has been around, broadly speaking, since the period of the Second International. It emerged, first of all, with, of course, Edward Bernstein, and became what was known then as the economism or economist tendency, which Lenin, of course, fiercely criticized, as we did Rosa Luxemburg. And this refers to the belief that by advancing trade union type economic demands and winning those, the working class would slowly work its way towards socialism. That there would be no need for the overthrow of the state, that with the extension of voting rights to the entire working class, that there would be no need for revolution anymore, because the votes of the working class would be enough to keep a social democratic government in power in perpetuity. Now, over a century and over 130 years since that point of view emerged, I think we can declare that it has been decisively proven wrong in every respect. And it's proven wrong principally because those who are putting it forward were never actually serious about pursuing a transformation of capitalism into socialism. Not really. What they wanted to do at best was to secure reforms, and at worst they wanted to carve out a place for themselves within the establishment circles in places like Germany, France, Italy, and Britain. That's what they wanted. Same with the legal Marxists of Russia, represented by Petr Struve, wanted to have a place, a respectable place for themselves amongst the bourgeois parties and influencers at the time of Tsarist Russia and bourgeois Russia. So you can also tell that those who came to embrace this philosophy, like Karl Kautsky, for instance, who opposed it at the time in the early 20th century, but later came to embody it, were never serious about the socialism, but were very serious about the parliamentarism. This is, of course, a paraphrase of a line used by Ralph Miliband, father of Ed and David, though the apple has fallen very, very far from the tree in both cases. One son turned out to be a CIA asset, the other one a bona fide moron. I'll leave it to you, good viewers and listeners, to work out which one is which. But in his book entitled Parliamentary Socialism, he uses the line that the Labour Party was never serious about the socialism, but was about the parliamentarism. See, what the leaders like Kautsky and others want to do is to essentially not have the working class become the ruling class. They want that. They want to rule over the working class and at best deliver reforms for them. And they want, and if that's your starting point, then you will be easily seduced by the trappings of bourgeois parliamentarism, which the bourgeoisie makes sure that they include plenty of trappings: higher wages, expense accounts, columns in national newspapers, national and global recognition, which brings with it a certain monetary reward, for instance, but it also brings with it a certain reward for the ego, and that shouldn't be underestimated. People being patted on the head by the bourgeoisie and told that they're very important and that they should be listened to and that they're great leaders and that they deserve, twice the average wage or 3 times the average wage for sitting on their ass in Parliament and doing not very much. Now, this leads to the creation of a parliamentary caste, a parliamentary fraction which is increasingly divorced from class struggle, which becomes hostile to class struggle because it starts to identify more and more with its fellow parliamentarians, regardless of party origin, and against what they regard increasingly as the anarchic class struggle. And you can see this hostility from social democratic MPs towards class struggle growing the longer that they spend in Parliament, because they become obsessed with bourgeois legalism, with bourgeois norms of behavior. Ultimately they end up defending the rule of the bourgeoisie. And this can happen to all kinds of people who be going to Parliament as so-called radical socialists. So reformism, as in working through bourgeois parliaments, is an obvious trap for communist parties. It's led to disaster in the Second International and to disaster in what became of the Third International. So let's ask ourselves the question then: would it ever be possible for the reformist approach to actually work? Because it's worth asking that question. Would it be possible, via winning a bourgeois election, that a process could be started which would lead to socialism? Now, in the imperialist countries, this has been, I think, pretty comprehensively proved to be impossible. We'll go into why in just a moment. In other countries, we have to look at it slightly differently. So, for instance, we mentioned before, Venezuela and Nicaragua, for instance, being two of them, which not just because they go through, they've won bourgeois elections, even though they have, but the reason why their revolutionary process is ongoing is precisely because they have carried out a mass politicization of the working class and peasantry and consistently mobilized them in defense of what it has described as revolutionary process. So there's institutions of working class power in Venezuela which are there regardless of the outcome of the bourgeois democratic elections. And the whole question here has to be looked at in these terms, which is, do the actions of let's just call it a social democratic party or a party pursuing power through bourgeois elections, do they lead to the strengthening of the power and the class consciousness of the working class, or do they dilute it? In the case of a place like Venezuela or Nicaragua, it's undoubtedly enhancing the class consciousness of the workers via their direct involvement in a revolutionary process. In the case of Western European social democracy, it's the opposite. It leads to a dilution of class consciousness and the demobilization of workers and a cringing deference to bourgeois parliamentarism. So the only way, let's just use the example of old perfidious Albion. The only way that a reformist process, the only way that a reformist process could actually work in a place like this country would be if you came to power and immediately sought to counterbalance the power of the state with the organized power of the working class. Now, there was let's just be careful about this. There were maybe a couple of times when this could have been done. So Clement Attlee himself admitted there could have been potentially a peaceful transition to socialism in 1945 because there was such a huge majority, not just for the Labour Party, but for a socialist transformation. Churchill, the great war hero, was resoundingly defeated and his programme rejected. It was rejected so harshly that the Tory party had to adopt a socialist sounding platform just to get back near power again. Had the Labour Party at that stage declared that they were going to begin a process of socialist transformation, meaning that every time the working class mobilized, that the Labour Party would take their side and would seek to utilize the power of the mobilized working class to support the aim of socialist transformations, rather than doing what they did do, which is when militant struggle emerged in places like the London docks, for instance, and far beyond London, or many other dock strikes, they used the army to break the strike. See, reformists are, of course, by their very nature of their beliefs, especially in imperialist countries, very treacherous. And what they did in the British case was take an opportunity for socialist transformation and make sure it didn't happen. So the only way you're going to be able to get that kind of transformation is if you build alternative power structures to the bourgeois state and empower and consistently empower them, which, by the way, is what the Venezuelans did when the reactionaries got control of the old National Assembly. The PSUV and I think it was Chavez just created another one, the Constituent Assembly, and just worked around it. So you would need to start creating community and workplace working class power, which would then be incorporate that power into the functioning of the existing state machine. Now, even that is a very, very difficult process, because in the imperialist countries, the existing imperialist state machine is very strong, and it has a lot of resources that it can use to stymie any kind of attempt, a sincere attempt at socialist transformation. They have, of course, the power of the military, which can only be counteracted by not only mass mobilizations of the working class, but an appeal to the ranks of the military itself. Whereas, of course, in the case of Britain, the Labour Party used the military to break strikes. They have the machinations of the secret police agencies. They have the courts on their side, which are largely staffed at the senior levels by representatives of the ruling class, or the very uppermost part of the petty bourgeoisie. They have the ability to rule your actions illegal, to tie you up in court for years. And then if you're a reformist party and you're tied up in court, what do you do? And then the answer for most social democrats is to throw their hands in the air and say, oh, it's been declared illegal. Well, don't worry, we'll reform it and we'll get a result within, say, 18 months to 2 years. You see, the only way you could sincerely pursue a socialist transformation in imperialist countries through the bourgeois democratic process is to essentially commit yourself to a process of mobilization that would enable you to essentially render the barriers placed in your way by the bourgeoisie to be irrelevant. meaning legal barriers, institutional barriers, or the barriers put up by, so we say, an attempted coup, which the British ruling class considered on a number of occasions in the post-war world. So the only way you would actually be able to do a socialist transformation, or even start one, by winning bourgeois elections, is if you essentially committed yourself to a process whereby you pushed out of the way or rendered irrelevant the state and wider, should we say, societal power of the bourgeoisie, meaning that you would need to essentially not fall into the trap of bourgeois legalism. That you would need to mobilize the working class to such an extent, and to keep the working class mobilized and organized, and also, to be quite frank, be ready to be armed in defense of the program of socialist transformation, that you might as well commit yourself to revolution anyway. Because especially in places like the imperialist countries, you would need to consistently dismantle the power of the bourgeoisie in terms of the power of the bourgeois state. And they're not going to just sit there and take that. They're going to use every tool at their disposal to stop you, which means that you, as the leaders of the working class movement, would need to use the most effective tools at your disposal to stop them, which include breaking up their forces, which include arming the workers, which include having organized armed groups of workers to essentially counter the armed bands of the bourgeoisie. It means taking away the bourgeoisie's ability to command the army. And in the British case, it would mean essentially removing the power of the monarchy, because that, as we've got a very interesting discussion of that coming up on the Decline and Fall show, the British monarchy. You would need to get rid of the oath that is taken to the monarch by the British Armed Forces and replace it with an oath to, shall we say, the people or the elected government or something like that. You would need to, and somebody says in the comments here, I'm just going to pick up an AIDS comment, Mexican courts consistently block many of Lopez Obrador's reforms here in Mexico. In response, they got a constitutional reform approved that makes judges, magistrates, etc., be elected by popular vote. And actually, that's one way of countering. And I remember when the Mexican government did that. I think it was either the Washington Post or the New York Times ran an article decrying the collapse of democracy in Mexico, because they'd suddenly made judges subject to popular vote, which, of course, from the point of view of the bourgeoisie, is horrifying. Even though in their more radical period, the bourgeoisie did want magistrates, judges to be elected by popular vote. And indeed, I believe in some elements of the some areas in the United States, that's still the case. I think you still do get elected judges in certain areas in the United States. But yes, the bourgeoisie and the imperialist countries regarded the Mexican essentially pushing the entrenched opposition of an unelected judiciary out of the way via the exposing them to popular votes as being a horrible manifestation of like socialist totalitarianism, which it goes to show what the democracy word really means, which is essentially it's a code for the defense of the rights of the bourgeoisie. If something defends or advances the property rights of the bourgeoisie, it's democratic. If something gets in the way of it or threatens it, then it's horrible and undemocratic and must be gotten rid of. So to actually advance to socialism via the reform process, via the process of winning bourgeois elections and keeping yourself in power, you would need to systematically dismantle the elements of reaction, the strongest elements of reaction within the state machine. So the courts, the armed forces, the police. You would need to either circumvent them or fundamentally change them. Now, of course, in places like Nicaragua and Venezuela, they have supporters inside the armed forces, for instance, which makes perhaps the process a little easier, considering that Chavez himself in Venezuela came from the armed forces. In case of Britain, no such luck at this stage. But there was, of course, again, go back to 1945, is a deliberate missed opportunity given by, and again, deliberate sellout by the Labour Party leaders, because you did have a huge number, millions, in fact, of working class men coming back from the war, having served for 3, 4, sometimes 5 or even 6 years overseas, and were coming back to Britain, determined that they were going to have fundamental changes in the country. So if you had have proceeded with socialist transformation, then there was every chance that the men who were returning from service in the war would actually have taken your side, and that the army in Britain would split between a small group of reactionaries and I think a bigger group who were determined to push forward towards socialism. See, that was a real opportunity to actually split the British armed forces that, again, the Attlee government deliberately did not take, and deliberately restored and protected the power of the officer corps over the armed forces, because the Attlee government was determined to defend capitalism at home and imperialism abroad. So you do get chances in particular moments in history where a revolutionary process could be started by winning a bourgeois election. But again, it would be dependent upon a wider movement existing that would be able to push for the destruction of, or the circumventing of, the institutions which give the bourgeoisie their power. And in the case of the imperialist countries, no such movement has ever existed. The communist parties in Britain, France, and Italy, and Spain and Portugal all capitulated before bourgeois legalism, and ended up, rather than it being the case that the communist parties pushed consistently the social democratic parties in a more radical direction, it was the case that the social democratic parties pulled the communist parties in an ever more reformist direction, until there was virtually no difference between them. And that is a sad damnation of the post-war communist parties, that I've said many times before. But it is theoretically possible for a socialist transformation to be begun that way, to begin via winning a bourgeois election. Again, you have to have an educated proletariat, or at least a vanguard that can mobilize the wider working class, that is ready to not only engage in struggle, but to take the message out to the wider working class that active struggle is necessary to overcome the resistance of the bourgeoisie. And for that, you need a leadership which is not tied down by bourgeois legalism. So you either need a sincere social democrats, not many of them around, or you need a powerful communist party that is prepared to step forward when the crisis hits and push much further, which is what none of the communist parties in Europe were prepared to do, even when the opportunity presented itself. So, for instance, in Britain, after 1967, the opportunity presented itself for escalation of the struggle, for the Communist Party of Great Britain, as it was back then, to actually push to implement their so-called British road to socialism. To actually make that work, it would have taken the Communist Party being much stronger in terms of pushing the Labour Party genuinely by looking to mobilize the working class consistently whilst the Labour Party was in government, and to keep pushing it in either in a more radical direction, or to push it out of the way. Instead of which, what the Communist Party of Great Britain was interested in was consolidating its position in the trade union bureaucracy, which is why the best working class militants in Britain started going away from the Communist Party and started joining things like the Trotskyites, the anarchists, various other different shades of light, of pseudo-revolutionary movements that talked the language of revolution but actually weren't that serious. But they certainly weren't joining the Communist Party, because that had essentially just become a reformist, purely reformist, bourgeois, legalistic organization. So just to wrap up this point, reformism is treacherous, because in the case of certainly the case of the imperialist countries, all of the socialist leaders who declared themselves to be advocates for peaceful change, weren't actually advocates for change at all. What they were advocates for was shoring up the rule of the bourgeoisie and making sure that the militancy of the working class was not unleashed in order to push for socialist transformation, but for that militancy to be constrained, restrained, or just, quite frankly, repressed. And that is the fundamental treachery of reformism. The reformist leaders are as hostile to militant class struggle as any reactionaries are. Right. Let us pause and go back to the top and look for questions. So, just having some more coffee here. Right. Balkan Tourist, hello to you, says, Alexander, if you wish to be amused by this debate between repugnant, self-hating Russian Jew and empire toady and Constantine, is it? And Euro-bourgeois leftist Yanis Varoufakis, a litany of terrible takes. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. You'd need a strong stomach to go through that. Hello to Bertram Clement. Hello, Davey. Hello to President Jesus. Hello to Walter. Hello to Chiurono. And hello to David Ball and Robert from the Belly of the Beast. Almir and the once and future Republic of Slovenia in the wider Yugoslav Federation. Hello to Albert Abtin, Mo 1917, James Graham, Rentier Oligarch, Chandler de Daversa from the war zone of Portland, Oregon, where Donald Trump has deployed the U.S., the 4th U.S. Cavalry under the leadership of George Armstrong Hegseth, you know. So be sure to see the recreation of the Battle of Little Bighorn in the streets of Portland, comrades. Jasmine Wolf, Jerry. We've also got Pat Spackman coming at us from Bristol. Will Johnson, Richard Madden. Hello to you all. Rentier Oligarch asks, what factors explain the PRC's capacity to resist the treachery of Zhao and its ability to renew itself with figures like Xi Jinping, while the USSR could not survive Gorbachev? Excellent question. Just in brief, I mean, the fact that the Zhao Ziyang in 1989, when he tried to pull a Gorbachev, was able to be removed, speaks to the fact that there was a stronger revolutionary tendency within the Communist Party of China than there was within the Soviet Party. See, it was only really less than a decade in 1989 when the Tiananmen Square events broke out and the full-blown counter-revolution was unleashed by the internal reactionaries. There had only been a decade since the repression of the Gang of Four and the coming to power of the Deng Xiaoping revisionist clique. Now, Zhao Ziyang and his clique undoubtedly thought that they were probably going to win because it seemed to be all going their way, internationally speaking. But there was a strong enough revolutionary tendency still within the CPC that had remained there and hadn't been wholly suppressed, and they were able to mobilize themselves to the point where the sort of the middle faction, the faction in the party that were not revolutionaries, but who were sort of, I would call them left revisionist types, or sort of those who still favored capitalist reforms but wanted to do it under the leadership of the party. The revolutionary wing was strong enough to push the left revisionist and the shall we say the pro-party sentiments, pro-party elements, into removing Zhao Ziyang and suppressing Tiananmen and suppressing the pro-capitalist demonstration there. And that explains the difference here. The difference between the CPC in 1989 and the CPSU in 1989 is the presence of that strong revolutionary wing that sadly was not there. It wasn't there in as strong enough numbers in 1989. Now, there was there were multiple opportunities when it became obvious what Gorbachev was doing. And it became obvious that it was, even if it wasn't obvious that he was an agent of imperialism, it was obvious that what he was doing was leading to disaster by 1989, and that it should be stopped. And he should be removed along with Yakovlev and the rest of the crew. And the tragic thing is that the Soviet Party had been in a revisionist, had been dominated by revisionists for far longer, arguably since the middle 50s, probably earlier. And what had happened was the revolutionary wing in the CPSU was just simply too small, wasn't powerful enough. Revisionism had been there too long. As to draw on what I was saying just a moment ago about reformism, it had deliberately ideologically disarmed the working class, whereas the memory of Mao's slogans and bombard the headquarters, etc., was still there within the CPC in 1989. So there were enough people in the CPC who could tell what Zhaojiang was and could actually push for action against him and his clique, and that they should be removed from power. I believe Zhaojiang ended up under house arrest for many years and then was released and lived very quietly. I think another one of the pro-capitalist conspirators fled and ended up in America, I think. But there were opportunities in 88 to 89 to stop Gorbachev and have him removed. And there were opportunities to defeat him. There were enough people in the CPSU, even like revisionists, and I would say that there's a difference between a left reformist and a right reformist. There's a difference between a left revisionist and a right revisionist. In the left revisionists, quite sincere, even the Brezhnevites didn't want the Soviet Union to collapse. Many of them didn't want the CPSU to be destroyed for a variety of reasons. So had there been a powerful enough revolutionary wing that could have said to the left and even the middle of the Soviet Party, look, this guy's leading us down the path to fucking destruction. Look at like the rebellions in the constituent republics led by petty reactionaries. Look at the fact that he's surrendering Soviet positions everywhere. Like, this is going to lead to a complete catastrophe. He needs to be removed now. And even if you ended up having to concede, the CPC revolutionaries still had to stomach the pro-capitalist period of Deng Xiaoping and Yang Zemin and others. But party rule was preserved, and the core elements of the socialist system were preserved. Had that kind of arrangement been in place, so had, shall we say, a revolutionary wing been able to basically push for the removal of Gorbachev and say to the revisionists, right, okay, you want pro-capitalist reforms, you want market reforms, well, we disagree, but we're prepared to go along with you on this in return for the ending of like glasnost, perestroika, the ending of the dismantling of the party, the ending of the so-called democratic reforms, and the suppression of the anti-party, anti-Soviet treacherous clique and their imprisoning. And if you're prepared to do that, then, well, you can fucking have your market reforms, but it's got to go along with a strengthening of the party, which is what's ended up happening in China consistently. You have like these sort of push and pull between like the various different factions in the CPC, between like the pro-capitalist faction and the revolutionary faction, with all the different revisionist factions in the middle, each pushing in different directions, which is why you end up with the line of the Chinese party being what it is, which is sometimes appears to be contradictory. But the tragic thing is that, again, like there was no revolutionary wing that could have laid the basis for that kind of arrangement. Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Almir says in the chat, which is even Deng Xiaoping was a revisionist, but I don't think he wanted to dissolve the CPC and the PRC. I think um, that is accurate there. I don't think Deng Xiaoping actually wanted to destroy the CPC and the PRC. Just as, in all honesty, I don't think Brezhnev did either. I mean, I know there's been multiple stories about how compos mentis Brezhnev was towards the end, but I don't think that Brezhnev actually wanted to destroy the USSR. I mean, he did a lot of things. Well, his group ended up doing a lot of things to contribute to that, but I don't think they did want to destroy it. I think that they ended up making a lot of mistakes that ended up again disarming the working class ideologically, which was disastrous. But I don't think they actually wanted to destroy the USSR. Again, like, unfortunately, revisionism went so far, and also the disarming of the party itself went so far as to render resistance against Gorbachev to be very difficult. What Khrushchev and the Brezhnevites said for so long was that they were reaching socialism. Socialism is just around the corner. We're in socialism. We're in a state of the whole people. There's no class contradictions anymore. And what that did was essentially made it so that even those officials in the party, like Vladimir Romanov, like Shebitsky and others, who, again, wanted to defend the USSR, many of them couldn't imagine until it was too late that that Soviet power could be so completely undone as it was. Many of them didn't imagine that it could go as far as it did with Gorbachev and Yakovlev. But these two, I mean, we should take their concessions at face value. They were pursuing nothing less than the total destruction of the USSR. And too many people, even in the hierarchy of the Soviet party, had no conception that that would be possible. That's what's that's what led to the disaster there. And unfortunately, in the case of China, there was a strong enough revolutionary wing to resist that happening, even if we ended up with this sort of curious mix of sort of market, or sort of capitalist and socialist methods being deployed, which you have today in modern China. So, Edward says, what is your opinion on bourgeois space science and exploration? How would space exploration and science look under a socialist system? Is space exploration stagnating now under capitalism? Yes. In answer to your last part, space exploration now is, I mean, since the early 90s, since the end of the Soviet Union, space exploration has slowed down to a crawl. So, I mean, so much so that you get like the ridiculous nonsense and the posturing of like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who end up doing less than the Soviet Union did 60 years ago with their like overly expensive and yet some strangely useless rocket systems. You end up doing less than was being done in the 60s. Like, if had technological progress continued in the rate that it was going in the early space program and in the Soviet period, like you could be looking at potentially like setting up like permanent stations on the moon as early as like the 90s. But like the whole thing just tailed off because like the revisionist leadership basically bollocksed it, USSR, and the imperialists lost interest when the Soviet Union was no longer present. Now the Chinese seemingly are making more advances in this area now, with there's talk of them putting in place some kind of manned station on the moon at some point soon. Be interesting to see who they get to work to work up there. I mean, the truth is, I mean, reason why private space exploration just doesn't work is that it's a very capital intensive project. Like, space exploration is very expensive. There's very little immediate return on investment for you. So like, Musk engages in it, but only with very heavy public subsidy. Like, Bezos's rocket can't even do what they were doing in the 60s. Like, Musk essentially gets it all underwritten by the state anyway. So like, private investors are not going to want to front up the cash for space exploration. It's a money pit. You can pour money into it and you're not going to get a return on it. The only way they would do it is if you get what Musk gets, which is to get the entire thing underwritten by NASA. To pick up on Theodoros Ibrahim's comment, could have been like moon base could have been possible in the 80s. Yeah, I mean, the Soviet Union was making like huge advances in space exploration by the 60s, in the early 60s. I know that there are those out there who claim the moon landing was fake. Haven't done enough reading on it yet. I kind of hope it was. I hope that those who put forward the theory that Kubrick confessed to being the director of the fake moon landing in The Shining, I hope that that theory is true. This is a very amusing theory to me. Walter Keating says, if you were born on the moon, you won't be coming to Earth. Within a generation, they would not be human at all. Please tell me your reasoning there. I mean, first of all, it's going to be a long time before they have people born on the moon, unless they're there already. Second of all, like, if you're born, I mean, yes, if you're born into entirely like artificial environment, like, you know, a controlled environment that's like relatively germ free, that's free of like normal human bacteria, because if you were in like an artificial environment, you're in an artificial environment, then you're going to be much more vulnerable to earthly bacteria. So if you are born on the moon, if you are born in those conditions, then it's you would be more at risk of disease if you came back to like this planet. So you would change a little bit, but I don't see that as being beyond human, Walter. I don't agree with you on that. So maybe we should do a specific space program stream. S. Starbeck asks, we can't send super chats. I deliberately don't monetize this channel because I did try a while ago, and all it ended up with, when you monetize stuff for YouTube, what you end up with is a ton more censorship. So like when I monetized briefly a while ago, you just end up with like a strike against your videos every single day. Like, you use any copyrighted material, you end up losing like whatever money comes your way via doing it. It's just not worth it, basically. If you want to support the show, there's a buy me a coffee link in the show description on YouTube, or you can take out a subscription on the Patreon channel. More Patreon exclusive content coming up this week, by the way. But yeah, I'm not monetizing the channel because it's just way too much censorship from YouTube. They genuinely they're more inclined to leave you alone if you don't monetize it. Chandler asks, can you explain the reformist ideas of those surrounding the Leningrad affair and what grounds did Stalin oppose them? Interesting question. you asked there, I would need to do more reading on it to be able to comprehensively answer your question, Chandler. So tell you what, can you email me that question at the regular address, and I will take a look about it. Hello to Javid in Merseyside. Is this going to be all about how I just wasted £55, 55 quid, on a bunch of clownish MPs who wash their dirty laundry in public because they want your party to fail? Well, it's not going to be all about that. I mean, we've done a grand total of free streams on in the past week. So they're all there on the archive. So, well, one of them is on the Decline and Fall channel with Professor David Miller. So that's the most comprehensive. So go and look at that. Then there's a discussion with myself, Laura, and Tara on Morbid Symptoms Media. That's on this channel. And there's a discussion with the Class Consciousness Project comic. That's also on this channel. So you can go and watch all of those. I mean, to be honest, the whole question of like the your party thing, I think it's going to be essentially it's going to have all the staying power of a wet flannel. It's just like useless. You can't have something existing which is so far removed from material reality, which is what this kind of social democracy is. And they're not even calling it social democracy or like socialism anymore. I will go back and read the article in New Left Review by Zara Sultana at some point, because that's worth looking at. See if her thoughts are evolving in an interesting direction. I doubt they are. Corbyn's thoughts certainly, well, I think the last original thought in his head withered up and died years ago, to be completely honest. But yeah, go and check the free programs that I've done in the last week on the Your Party thing, Javid. Be interesting to see what you think. Let's just Rentier Oligarch says, always ask democracy for whom, as per Lenin. Yep. Alan asks, what do you think about gun culture in America? I get the sense that the petty bourgeoisie is more armed than the actual working class, but I don't know. Well, I don't know for sure. I mean, I think that well, give me an indication, like American viewers. Like, it strikes me that like some of the more high-powered stuff in the United States in terms of weaponry is pretty fucking expensive. Like, what's it called? Like AR-15s, like the automatic rifles. I know there's other options, but like how possible is it in terms of finances for like the great bulk of the American working class to actually own at least one firearm? Possible. I always got the impression that like maybe workers will own like a handgun, but sort of petty bourgeois types will probably have like a couple of rifles, or maybe like like those that proletarians that live in the countryside might have a hunting rifle, might actually do a bit of hunting, get food, maybe hunt some game that way. But I'd be interested in the breakdown here, because obviously we in old perfidious Albion, I mean, you can own a firearm here. It is possible, but there's a massive like bureaucratic bunch of loopholes that you got to jump, bureaucratic processes, hoops you've got to jump through. So it's not. I mean, it's not something I'd be interested in doing. So what I'd say with regard to this is that gun culture in the United States at the moment, of course, is tied to reactionaries. We see how quickly they change their tune, though, when you see revolutionary groups try to start using the U.S. Constitution for more radical ends. So the right to bear arms. When the Black Panthers started exercising their constitutional right to bear arms, suddenly, like Ronald Reagan was in favor of gun control when he was governor of California. So it changes pretty quickly. So I would say that gun culture at the moment is reactionary. It's dominated by reactionary tendencies. But the lesson from the Panthers is that the working class should in the United States seek to exercise its constitutional right to own and train in arms. And of course, this has to be done carefully. Of course, as soon as you start doing that, like the Black Panthers did, you'll be subject to all kinds of infiltration from federal law enforcement agencies and state law enforcement agencies, and be subject to all kinds of provocateurs who will turn up and say, "Hey there, comrades, fancy doing some gun crime? I fancy doing some gun crime. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Please speak into my lapel." But I would say that, yes, the Black Panthers approach should be learnt from in terms of sticking by the laws, and certainly not falling for the idea that that gun control as pushed for by the Democrats is anything other than something which is going to lead the working class only to a terrible reactionary mess. The ruling class themselves will desperately try to pull up the drawbridge on guns and their availability for the working class if things turn nasty in the United States. Certainly shouldn't be any indulgence of the liberal argument regarding gun control. Albert says there are hundreds of right-wing groups who are armed to the teeth and nothing happens to them. Well, that's because these people ultimately work for the federal government. We know all these militia groups, fascist organizations, many of them will have federal agents undercover in them, federal informers, various police informers within them. These groups will essentially be they're pawns on a chessboard to be pushed around by the state, the American state, when it wants to move them. And that's why they get away with so much. Let's have a look. Trump has started Red Scare 2.0. It's a pretty shit version of the Red Scare, but he's trying. He's trying because he's not got much else. Brent here, oligarch, says U.S. petty bourgeoisie like the asphyxiation revolution, but don't even appreciate the fathers. 90% of boomers say no political violence. But Virginia state flag has an unalived tyrant on it. I'm going to have to go and check that right now. Virginia state flag. Oh shit, yeah, Sic Semper Tyrannis. Let's have a look. Is that the sort of representation of the death of the deposing of the Roman king? That's interesting. I didn't know that. So, well, as you'll know from our interviews with Comrade Marius, the American bourgeoisie is very careful to not allow the radical implications of its own history to become too widely known. Right. Let's have a look. Almir asks, do you think the Palestinians will be able to stay in Gaza and the wider Palestine, or do you think they'll be driven out? Gaza, I wouldn't like to speculate. I mean, they're hanging on so far, but the bigger question, the question is where are they going to shove them? If they're going to try, they obviously want to remove them. The only reason they've not been removed so far is A, that they're determined to stay, and B, that the Egyptians and Jordanians, who the US was pushing under Biden, was pushing for them to accept the Gaza population as refugees. Even the regime of General Sisi in Egypt and the puppet king of Jordan, even they wouldn't have anything to. They would be terrified of what would happen if they were seen to be collaborating with that. So the Palestinian resistance continues, which is why the Israeli regime is just trying to reach the point where there will be the demand for mass exodus will become overwhelming. So far, it doesn't look like that is happening, but I wouldn't like to speculate on how much longer the population there can hang on for. The question of the West Bank is much more difficult for the US imperialists and the Israeli regime because there is like a consistently strong resistance there, and consistently strong resistance amongst the refugee camps, and also now you've got this sort of pathetic non-state recognized as a state by the imperialist bloc, which is the state of Palestine, ruled over by the arch comprador creep Mahmoud Abbas. It's going to be difficult for them to expel them en masse from the West Bank. The Israeli regime still has to push forward with its plans to annex the West Bank. Whether they will be successful is another question. Whether the regime of Abbas is able to hang on if the Israeli regime steps up its repression in the West Bank is another question. So the West Bank is a much more difficult nut to crack now. And they've still not settled things in Gaza, and they still can't fully hold Gaza. So it's an open question at the moment. I'm going to have to tell you that at the moment, I don't know like how this is going to turn out now. I'm going to have to do more research into it and try to discern like where this is going. Trump keeps announcing that he's got some sort of deal. I think that exists purely in his head. If the Netanyahu government accepts anything less than the mass expulsion of the Palestinian population of Gaza, then Netanyahu himself is politically finished and therefore is potentially open to further prosecution and imprisonment. And also that the likes of Smotrich and Ben Gvir may also be finished. They may be abandoned by their followers, and they might embrace other, even more reactionary individuals to represent them. So they have to go in. The question of whether they can keep going is an interesting one. So more research required, basically, for me to before I can properly answer that question, essentially. Irish Partisan says the vlogger Mist had a contestant trapped inside a burning home to win 500 grand in his new video. We have the dystopian level of degenerate late-stage capitalism. Paul Verhoeven's Robocop was indeed prophetic. Indeed it was. Scrolling down here, let's have a look. Hello to Richard, who comes to us from Las Vegas. WF451, that Fahrenheit 451 reference there. East Europeans think that the Soviets prevented them from living like in Beverly Hills 90210 and having that kind of lifestyle. Even that moron Sikorsky said as much. Yeah, well, you'd expect him to say that. Like that's what he's paid to say. Ordinary people thinking it is a bit more depressing, considering that they can see the effects of capitalism all around them. Theodorus Ibrahim says we have a communist space colonization group if anyone is interested. Interesting. Rentier Oligarch says Bezos' launches are embarrassing. He's managed to match Alan Shepard's flight path so far, who didn't even orbit the Earth like Gagarin did. Yeah. Moon base could happen in the 80s. Yeah. WF451 says whole moon landing was a monumental fraud. Can't believe people still believe it happened. Honestly, playing golf on the moon. I mean, honestly, don't know enough about it. Willing to watch any or read any recommendations that those of you who believe that the moon landing was fake recommend me something to watch or read, and I will look at it. Walter Stolzing says The funniest cope I've recently heard about the USSR's lead in space exploration is that because they had no respect for human life, they burned through astronauts by the hundreds and didn't care, which isn't even true. It's ridiculous. Davey says the hope that the British Army would side with us against the establishment is a pipe dream, as their historic use against British workers of the past proves. At the moment, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's a reason why the British ruling class hasn't liked draft armies. They did away with the draft in the late 50s. They prefer a small professional force that can be relied upon to do domestic repression. I mean, if it was a draft army, there'd be more chance of a rebellion. A smaller, fully professional force, there is less of a chance of a rebellion. Also, less of a chance that a small force like that can actually put down a nationwide rebellion. The army at most is 80,000 men, only 40,000 odd of which can be considered to be combat ready. Many of those are deployed around the world. They only have 30 odd tanks. So when you look at it like that, like the British Army ain't much anymore. Of course, it could still do some damage, but could they cope with a nationwide rebellion? No, not anymore. Nor could the relatively small numbers of police forces. This is an interesting conundrum that the ruling class has given us. They've actually dismantled the in terms of numbers, their own machinery of domestic repression. One can expect them to try to expand it relatively soon. Almir asks, if the moon landing was fake, why didn't the Soviets expose them? It's an interesting question. I mean, again, we're assuming it was fake. I mean, I don't know as of yet. I've yet to see any convincing evidence. Again, I will read or watch whatever those who have knowledge on this suggest. But it's the question. So if it was fake, why didn't the Soviets expose them? Well, bear in mind who was in the Soviet leadership at the time. You had a bunch of revisionists who wanted to do a deal with US imperialism constantly. So why would they have an interest in basically telling the world that the US just conducts a gigantic fucking lie? There is also the possibility that the US did send like a rocket up there. They did send a capsule to the moon, and it did look as if they'd done it. So it wasn't all just Hollywood theatrics. They did send something in that direction. And so it wasn't immediately obvious that it was a fake. But also I'd say it's also a political problem, which is that the Soviets knew more about the fakery and like the lies of US imperialism, and did expose some of it, but wouldn't expose all of it, because again, the Soviet leadership always wanted a deal with the US. They didn't actually want to expose all of the shit that they'd done. Right, I see we have a twat in the chat, so I'm just going to exercise that particular demon. There we go. Sorted. Okay. Well, the funny thing is, just to go back to the question about the Soviets didn't value human life. Well, why do you think that capitalism values human life? To those that believe that, like, capitalism has burned through the lives of millions and millions of workers. Like, everything capitalism is built on, like, blood and bone, like a mountain of fucking skulls. So why on earth did they get to portray themselves as the ones who valued human life? They never did. They don't to this day. Look at people they've killed. They're responsible for killing in Ukraine, because it's all them that is responsible for this. Like the Russians were desperate to not have this war. It was a war that's been forced on them. The responsibility for killing potentially millions of Ukrainians lies with the imperialists. they look at how many of their own people they were prepared to condemn to death in World War One. It's only fear of a revolt of the population that stops them marching off to war against the Russians now. Fear of the revolt of the population, also the sheer incapacity of modern capitalism to actually produce things in an efficient fashion. So no, this isn't a system that values life. It never was. Right. Mr. Nobody Free says, if the moonlight landings were fake, the first indication would be the material analysis of the dust samples of the Apollo program brought back, especially compared to the samples from the Chinese mission. Interesting. No, I don't think the Americans are beginning giving those. Have they been studied? Have the moon samples been studied by scientists outside of the US? Don't know. Myself, of course. John Wilkes Booth did shout death to tyrants in Latin. Yes, pretentious actor that he was. And also a potential witting or unwitting agent of British imperialism. More on that in the future. Hello to Zama in Phoenix, Arizona. ACDT asks, I've noticed this trend of seemingly reactionary people blaming the ills and twisted fruits of capitalism on communism despite living in imperial countries. Where does this idea come from? It's a classic fascist thing or reactionary thing. And again, like reactionaries have always done this, like from the earliest days. Certainly after the Bolshevik Revolution, they blamed like hidden Marxists for all the damage that capitalism does. You see this all the time with like the sort of reactionary stooges like Douglas MacGregor, etc., going about it's the neocons and the globalists who have been exercising their power through the likes of Woodrow Wilson to turn America into a state ruled over by an NKVD consisting of Antifa and Soros-funded Bolshevik lunatics like Tony Blinken. You know, it's gibberish. It's like some people like that, some of these reactionaries are not unintelligent, but like they're so far gone on like anti-communist hysteria that even those of them like McGregor and others who can recognize the deleterious effects of like American capitalism still can't bring themselves to admit that the problems of in the contemporary United States are the problems of American capitalism. You know? Yeah, I'm working on the McGregor impression, Slumbering Colossus. I think now it sounds more like Nixon. President Jesus says Nick Fuentes probably has a monetized YouTube at this point. Well, he started shilling for Israel. He's always been shilling for US imperialism, so now he's like going out to bat for Israel. So yeah, he's probably going to be getting that money pretty soon. So much for the extremely online Nazis, huh? But then again, the fascists always liked Zionism. They just pretended not to. Edward says, will the effectiveness of US and British bourgeois state repressive security organs decay along with imperial economic social decay? If so, will that allow for organizing communists much easier? It's an interesting question. The effectiveness of the repression and the effectiveness of the state organs, the special bodies of armed men, the intelligence men, it's clearly that they're not what they used to be. I would say it's clear that they are. Just having a look at the time. It's clear that they're not actually doing the same work that their predecessors did in terms of their effectiveness. Whether they can suddenly upgrade themselves again is an interesting question. I don't think that they can. So they've got greater powers than they ever had before, in theory, but their ability to actually properly use them is less than it was. It's like they can detain you more, but so for instance, the cops today in Britain, they've got more powers to like arbitrarily detain you, but they're less brutal than they used to be. Like, they still beat people up, of course, they still do crimes, but they're not quite what they were in like the early 1980s, where they could literally like haul you off the street, beat the living shit out of you, and chuck you out of the onto the street again. No one would raise any questions about it. So it's an interesting like set of contradictions that we find ourselves in. Like, they've got more repressive powers than ever, but their ability to properly use them is some less than it would have been like 40 years ago. 40 years ago, they could like disappear somebody off the street, like into blag them, and like there would be no trace of it. There would be traces of it now, because it's one of the sort of contradictions, because if they black bag somebody, especially if it's a public figure, and their online footprint suddenly goes dead, it'll be pretty obvious what happened to them if they've just gone missing. Whereas like a few decades ago, had they done that, it might have come out eventually, but they would have had more time to enact their foul plans. It's an interesting set of contradictions that we find ourselves in. They have all this power in theory, but their ability to actually exercise it, I would argue, is lessened in the British case than what it was. So, opinion on Bakunin or any other names in anarchy. Bakunin was clown. Really an interesting book on him and other populist and socialist movements in 19th century Russia at the moment. He's an interesting melodramatic clown, basically, a supporter of the Confederacy, not a serious thinker, not a serious individual in many respects, an adventurer, nothing more. Not even as like, I would give credit to like somebody like Enrico Malatesta, sort of an Italian anarcho-syndicalist, as a sort of, or even Kropotkin, as more serious intellectual influences. Bakunin was a clown, though. Balkan Tourist says, Poland opening up the border to the EU from Belarus, they realize their economy will be buggered without Chinese trade. Yeah, the Chinese told them, open the border or we'll find other ways around you, basically. And I think that the Germans panicked and told the Poles, you better open the border. Because without the Chinese trade, like, Europe will be screwed. And I don't think the German ruling class is willing to give up that Chinese trade as of yet, even with all the mess that they've got themselves into over the Russia war. Thanks, Jenny, for the suggestion. Let's just go down here. Alan says, Labour, your party should have been called Labour Party 2. Would have been less cringe. They're probably still considering that as a name. Jan Hap 1 says, do you see a way to rinse the Home Office and Zionist influence from the so-called left in Britain? The actually existing left that we talked about with like David Miller this week, or last week, sorry. Look, that element of it is fucked. Like, forget it. It's done. It's over with. The official left is a disaster zone. We are best starting from scratch, to be honest. Because if you lead people in, if you lead working people into your party, what are you leading them into? State trap, basically, is like is what you're leading them into. So forget the actually existing left, hopelessly riddled with like state influence. We do better being honest about where we find ourselves and rebuilding from the ground up. There's no shortcut around this. And this goes to Edward's question about how do you deal with the fact that you might not see a revolution in your lifetime. Well, you do your best to actually prepare the ground for the next generation, basically. That's what you do. You accept the fact that you might be too old to play an active role. You may even have gone into exile. by the time that it happens, but you put down as many roots as you can so that the next generation can grow in the in more fertile soil, shall we say. Moving through the comments. Aziz says, I don't know who voted for Millet. He was a screaming billionaire parasite bootlicker. Well, Millet, like all of the reactionaries post 1917, they have to pretend to be sort of revolutionaries of some description or another. They have to pretend to be oppositional. And hence that's why he engaged in all those melodramatics. It's why he's got the chainsaw. It's why he's doing all the eccentric behavior, the costumes, everything like that. It's all essentially to convince the politically under or uneducated Argentine that he's going to do something radical. Also, bear in mind, Millet won partially, or actually no, largely because, yes, he attracted a certain vote due to of disillusioned workers, because the Peronists, the left Peronists under Cristina Kirchner, etc., had fucked up and demoralized people to the point where a Millet could break through. But the Millet, his government is essentially him fronting for like the forces that were previously behind Maurizio Macri. And so in reality, behind all of the anarcho-capitalist drivel that he spouts, it's just the same old reactionary Argentine ruling class. And this is like it's the same reactionary groups that basically favor Argentina remaining in the status of a neo-colony. And Millet specifically said that when he was elected. He was specifically talking about the great period in the late 19th century when Argentina had this amazing economy. You hear this from like petty reactionaries all the time. You said the same shit that like Tucker Carlson talks about Venezuela. Like, I'm gonna try and do a Tucker Carlson impression now. No, don't think I've quite got it. It goes, I think he said, in the early before Chavez, this isn't a very good impression, but I'm going to persist with it. Venezuela was one of the most advanced places in all of America. Imagine it, ruined by Marxism. That's venturing into Jordan Peterson territory there. But like Millet said something very similar, which is like similar bullshit that like British reactionaries talk about Argentina. That there was this great period at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, that where Argentina was this great developing economy, and it was ruined by socialism, or ruined by Juan Perón indulging the trade unions and flirting with socialism, etc., etc. And this is all bullshit, of course. The actual truth about Argentina in the late 19th century was that it was, as Lenin notes in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, it was something that was dominated by British banks. Like, in fact, Argentina was like a sort of classic case of like what British imperialism would go on to be, which is not necessarily direct colonialism, but domination by control of the banking system. And so what you've got with Argentina post Galtieri, post junta, was like a series of governments which essentially acted to keep Argentina enslaved under neo-colonial chains. And this includes like various elements in Peronism, like in the early 1990s, which again like racked up an awful lot of debt. And this again, this led to the crisis of the later 1990s and early 2000, where like the IMF debt was like phenomenally high. So you got like the likes of Carlos Menem, who racked up like gigantic amounts of debt. You then get his immediate successor, like Fernando de la Rua, who was overthrown by a mass uprising in late 2001. I remember it very well. And he was literally chased out of office. You get like the reforming period of the Kirchners. So like, broadly speaking, 2003 to like 2015. Then their reform process stuttered and failed because, again, they couldn't address one of the most central issues, which is the gigantic Argentine debt, and Argentina being sort of bound into like neo-colonial debt trap mechanisms, some of which, of course, is owned by like uber parasites like Paul Singer in the United States. So you had like Argentina being taken to court in New York to enforce the debt claims of Paul Singer. So debt being held by foreign entities is a huge issue. But the bigger issue, and perhaps even bigger than the debt being held by the United States, is debt being held by the Argentine ruling class. Because that's where a huge amount of Argentine national debt is actually owned. So Milei is there to not only make sure that Argentina remains an underdeveloped, partially deindustrialized place where essentially the American imperialists can engage in, and British imperialists can engage in like resource extraction and like exploitative agricultural practices, but also that the tribute keeps flowing to the Argentine bourgeoisie, which is, again, essentially, it's why, in my view, Kirchnerism ultimately failed. And it failed because it failed to dismantle the power of the Argentine bourgeoisie, who are utterly rotten, utterly despicable, and play no progressive role whatsoever. That's why Argentina's only ever gone forward when essentially they've been circumvented or sidelined. So, like, unless you're prepared to match at least what's being done in Venezuela or Nicaragua, then you're going to get fucked every single time. And so, to go back to the debate about reformism, unless your movement has teeth and can bite back against the machinations of the bourgeoisie, who are fully prepared to have a nation like Argentina be stuck in perpetual neo-colonial servitude, unless you're prepared to take them on and remove their power and remove the power of the American imperialists who influence things inside Argentina, you're fucked. You're going to be continually fucked. This is the nature of things. So that's the reality of Milei. Milei is not only a servant of American imperialism, and he absolutely is, and a servant of British imperialism. No danger of a Malvinas rerun from him. But he's principally an agent of the Argentine ruling class, who are absolutely despicable, backward, reactionary scum to a man and woman. There's nothing progressive there at all. Let's go through here. ACDT says, I'm in the UK and it blows my mind that people blame communism and say BlackRock and Keith Starr are a communist. People are very fucking confused, incredibly confused. It's like with people like that, and you see a few of them, like they are almost there in some respects because they know that Starmer's their enemy. That's true. They do even know that like the big monopolists are their enemies. but they don't have. They're so lost with regard to what they think socialism and communism is, that they end up like falling prey to Yaxley Lennon, Farage, various other like petty reactionaries, because like they haven't been able to put the pieces together yet. It's our job to put the pieces together for them, even if they're not listening at this stage. McGregor says, globalism is Bolshevism. I still need to work on that impression. Yeah, and his example, according to President Jesus, was Trotsky. Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, Trotsky, like, you know, was a lot of things, including like a fascist collaborator. But the idea that he was like the sort of a sort of, I mean, he was a servant of imperialism ultimately, wasn't invent anything. He was a man who would have been used to restore capitalism in the Soviet Union. But again, reactionaries can never admit fully like what imperialism actually is. Walter Keating says Kamala Harris accused Donald Trump of being a communist. Well, of course she fucking did, because Kamala Harris is a fucking moron. Walter Stolzing says Bakunin was friends with Wagner. Wagner at least had musical talent. Yeah. I mean, the thing about like people like Wagner is an interesting example. Wagner, I think, was a younger man, like part of the revolution of 1848, if I remember correctly. A lot of like intellectuals were involved in that. And what you find with a lot of like these reactionary types is in the 19th century, reactionary intellectuals, is that like they were adjacent to some kind of like bourgeois revolutionary tradition for a while as younger men, and that they retained their sort of predilection towards like a worship of action and drama that came from like a lot of like bourgeois revolutionary movements, like the 1848 revolution, like the actions of Garibaldi in Italy. Like Mussolini, for instance, used to claim that he was continuing the Risorgimento of Garibaldi. He was completing it, in fact. But of course, like everything can be turned into its opposite. Like a revolutionary from one generation is a reactionary in another generation. And so, like Bakunin and co, like I think Bakunin could always just be classified as a reactionary. Wagner's was a virulent anti-Semite and a sort of a supporter of German imperialism, but at least his music was good. To go back to the original comment, Bakunin was just a boring fat bastard who supported the Confederacy. Right, okay, 8:45. Let's keep going here. Let's see. Balkan Tourist says, just wonder how so-called Marxists in the West who deride China and Russia as imperialists will defeat West imperialism. Vote them out. Well, Balkan Tourist, I hate to disappoint you, but those who deride Russia and China, those leftists don't want the end of imperialism. They want a revival of imperialism. They want Russia and China to be defeated by the West, because they want the West to revive. Because if the West revives, they might get a few more crumbs brushed off the edge of the rich man's table, and they might end up with being able to revive their beloved social democracy. This is the unspoken secret of most of the social democrats, is that they are devotees of imperialism in secret. Some of them not so secret, like the likes of the Alliance of White Liberals, the Alliance of Workers' Liberty, the micro Trotskyite outfit. They are openly imperialistic. Many of the others, though, were closet imperialists. They like their imperialism quiet. They like their imperialism to be done in such a way as to not become too obvious, which is why so many of them go along with the horrors in Ukraine and don't say anything about it or blame Putin for it or blame the Russians for it. But they'll jump up and down about Gaza quite rightly. But even their analysis of Gaza will be wrong. Their analysis of the Palestinian question will be wrong, because they'll ascribe it to they'll ascribe it to either just Netanyahu being a scumbag, he is, or they'll ascribe it to excesses on the part of the Israeli government, or they'll say that there should be a two-state solution or something like that, or they'll say that that Hamas is as bad as the Zionists, something like that. And what it all comes down to is that these people don't really want the end of imperialism, because it's if imperialism ends, if the ability of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, to lesser degrees, or the United States, if they lose the ability to hyper-exploit the neo-colonial world, then that's going to cause an internal collapse. And nobody really wants to face that. People don't want to face that. In fact, people are desperate to not face that. And it's also the fact, and this is a brutal truth, that most of the people on the left in the imperialist countries are phenomenally uneducated. They're phenomenally ignorant when it comes to the question of what the system actually is and what dismantling it would mean, and what fighting for socialism would mean. They're phenomenally ignorant, incredibly poorly read. Generally, a lot of these people, and I'm talking not just talking about the current generation, I'm talking going back to like 80s, 70s, 60s, like anything really like post 50s, like a lot of the so-called leftists who talk to like a big game, when you get down to it and you look at like the things they wrote, and you dig into it and you see these people hadn't read much Marxism. These people hadn't read and these weren't just like rank and file people. These were like supposed leaders. These people had barely read the essentials. These people had barely read the most important parts of Lenin's work. These people didn't even encourage the members of their organizations to read anything. Sometimes, they're talking about the Maoists in the West now, anything outside the quotations in the Little Red Book. So you had like these revolutionary opportunities come along, only to find like the so-called revolutionaries were, again, phenomenally underdeveloped, intellectually speaking, for not Marxists at all. Like they had like a few smatterings of like little bits of Marxist knowledge, and when that didn't accord with what they saw as the struggle in their nations, they just gave up the Marxism and became social democrats. And to go back to Chuarono's point, Western left is just a bunch of hedonist freaks that serve the bourgeoisie. They are there to damage the true communism. I think that's exactly right. Like when the working class showed that it was actually willing to struggle in Britain and France and Italy, again we come back to the point: the so-called communists ran in the other direction and ultimately demoralized and destroyed their own movement, and the Trotskyites and the Maoists proved totally incapable of picking up the slack, because these people were mostly phenomenally un-Marxist as well. And again, like you take some time it takes a certain amount of reading and educating yourself to realize just how theoretically undeveloped these so-called communists were and are It's not a new thing. The previous generations might have been a little bit better read, but again, Marx and Engels were despairing of the anti-theoretical attitude of like the British workers' movement, but the British intellectuals aren't much better. They're really not. I mean, how else do you think that like you could get away with Aaron Bastani can be held up as a fucking intellectual? How else do you think that like that guy could be presented as a Marxist? How else do you think that like Paul fucking Mason, a state asset and a pretty fucking obviously dumb one at that, could be presented as a Marxist? How else do you think that Yanis Varoufakis can pass for a great intellectual? Because at least he has done some reading. Not enough, but some. Balkan Torres says the Western quote-unquote communists didn't support the East when the anti-revolution came. Well, they supported the overthrow of the people's democracies in the Soviet Union. Most of them did anyway, or just sat there and passively accepted it. That's the point. Right, just scrolling through some comments here. Balkan Torres says the proletariat in Eastern Europe is halfway to staging the revolution, being mobilized through nationalism. There are two types of nationalist movements: those in support of imperialism, and those who are fighting against imperialism. Interesting. I mean, I've seen like some manifestations of like the fact that there is a body of opinion in certain countries in Eastern Europe which is hostile to imperialism. That's good. I mean, you see it in Bulgaria. We'll see what happens in Moldova. I suspect the EU has successfully stitched that up again. But with the fate of Ukraine being such a horror, you have to believe that there will be some kind of like pushback against the EU and NATO within the populations, particularly when the European economy slides down the fucking toilet, which it will soon. Okay, Irish Badazan wants a Tom Perez impression. Tom Perez, I cannot comment on whether we lost the popular vote. I can only comment that this man Trump is a threat to our democracy. It's pretty easy. ACDT says, I can't watch norovirus media anymore. The more you study socialism, you outgrow these crappy channels. Well, you certainly should do. You certainly should do. Balkan Torres says, many non-liberal workers in Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova are saying that we were better off during socialism, but they won't say socialism is the way to go. Well, it's a start. I mean, the fact is that, like, the capitalists in these countries have had it their own way for a generation, and they've manifestly failed, like completely and utterly failed. And you see population collapse, you see mass poverty, corruption, all in all of these countries. The only people benefiting being like a tiny bourgeois and like a rotten political establishment. So like, the devastating impact of the counter-revolution is slowly being undone by the actions of the capitalists themselves. And you will finally see the re-emergence of powerful socialist movements in the East, probably heavily influenced by the truth that Russia is going in. Edward says, the thing I haven't understood living in bourgeois colonial Latvia, historical nihilism is one of the most powerful anti-communist weapons. The fact that the Latvians guarded Lenin and built the USSR is replaced. This is an interesting question, because there is a proud revolutionary history in the Baltic states, which I spoke to Comrade Isko Lat about a while ago, and this is something which is proof of the fact that like the dangers of Khrushchevism, because like Khrushchevism started the process of like the openly embracing historical nihilism, as Edward puts it, and dismantling the dictatorship of the proletariat, which was needed in places like the Baltic states, in places like Ukraine, where there was so many fascist collaborators, that those people needed to be continually suppressed. This is the truth, and we shouldn't apologize ever for the suppression of fascists or the suppression of collaborators with imperialism. Because look at what the collaborators with imperialist collaborators have done to all of these nations. They've reduced all of them to underpopulated, deindustrialized, like nightmares. So this is what the Gorbachevs and the Khrushchevs of the world do. So we should make no apology whatsoever for, for instance, defending the reputation of Stalin, and for saying that the revisionism is a wholly pernicious force, and that the revisionists and the social democrats crying about state repression, what about the small farmers, what about the kulaks? It's like, well, the truth be told, in the USSR, if you can find fault with Stalin, is that he in the later period there was not enough repression. Truth be told, in a later period, this is not just a question of Stalin. This is a question of the balance of forces in the Soviet Party. There is always the story that Stalin was preparing another purge before his death, which leads some to believe he was murdered. That Stalin was fully aware of the dangers that were growing within the party and was trying to find ways to act against it, but this was ultimately thwarted by his death. Sometime soon, we will go into the things that happened immediately after Stalin's death, because there's some interesting things that happened there. But the point about dictatorship, and the point about the need to suppress our enemies, we should make no apology for suppressing enemies. Look at what happens when they are let off the leash. Look at what happens when you stop suppressing them. They infest like the upper echelons of even the party itself. And yes, there's things to be learned about the failures of the administrative measures that were taken in the 1930s and the purges. There's the failures of the Cultural Revolution. There's things to learn from that. But we should never apologize for suppressing the enemies of human progress. Never. And we shouldn't. I mean, the thing, to go back to the point about Eastern Europe, one of the big failures in a place like the Polish People's Republic was the failure to actually collectivize the land. That allowed sort of reactionary tendencies to fester there for decades. And again, Khrushchevite revisionism is a big part of the reason why that process was not carried through. Right. Okay. So it is hitting the 9 o'clock mark. Thanks to all those of you watching on all platforms. So let's just see how many we've got. We have just over 400 of you watching, which is very good. Thank you for tuning in. The recording of this will be up to tomorrow morning on the Patreon site, so keep an eye out for that. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and your coffee. Just before we end, I'll just read out a comment from Slumbering Colossus, who says, damn good point. See Stalin in the West to him. Yeah. The reason why the West hates Stalin and Mao, but particularly Stalin over and above absolutely everybody else, is precisely because of the successes in the 1930s and 40s. It's precisely because Stalin led the Soviet Union at a time when global reaction was defeated. That's what reason why they loathe Stalin so much. And the fact that the domestic reactionaries were suppressed is the reason why the petty bourgeois reactionaries like Khrushchev despise him so much. So, bringing things to a close, thanks to everybody who supports the program on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. More coming up this week. Another episode of Decline and Fall will be with you tomorrow. That's our interview with Andrew Lowney, who has published a book on the rather foul Marquis de Sade-like, shall we say, activities of a certain Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, better known by his stage name of Prince Andrew. So keep an eye out for that one on the Decline and Fall show tomorrow. Later on in the week, we will have coming up on this channel the first part of our Sino-Soviet split series. Keep an eye out for that one. And again, I thank everybody who has tuned in tonight, and I will throw you back over to your musical outro.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.